A very warm welcome to the 2021 annual conference of the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment, short GRASFI. My name is Christoph Nedopil, and I'm the director of the Green Finance and Development Center at Fudan University. It is wonderful to see so many people online, and it is my great honor to be the moderator of this opening session. At this year's GRASFI conference is both full of absolutely fantastic content, and as we try to accommodate all different time zones in Asia, Africa, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, we have a very tight program, and we need to stick to the schedule, of course, without too much buffer. So, and also please note that this conference will be recorded and all sessions will be made available on demand for you within the platform. Therefore, to save time without much ado, I want to welcome Professor Wang Yao, the host of the 2021 GRASFI conference. Professor Yao Wang is the Director General of the International Institute of Green Finance at the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing. She also serves as Deputy Secretary General of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking, as advisor to the Sustainable Finance Program at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and at the University of Oxford, and as a consultant for the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. Wang Yao, very great to see you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you around the world. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 4th annual conference of the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment, GRASFI. It is an absolute honor for the International Institute of Green Finance, IIGF, at the Central University of Finance and Economics to organize the conference this year, after it was successfully held at Maastricht University in 2018, the University of Oxford in 2019, and the Columbia University last year. This year is very special to the Alliance and us, as it is the first GRASFI conference hosted in the emerging economy and the first one in Asia, one of the most vibrant sustainable finance markets in the world. The Alliance was founded to promote multidisciplinary academic research on sustainable finance and investment. In this regard, GRASFI plays a vital role in creating a platform that nurtures academic collaboration among researchers and helps graduate students and junior academics grow their expertise in sustainable finance. Despite the dynamic development of green and sustainable finance around the global, the current financing gaps for sustainable development of emerging economies have only widened after the COVID-19 crisis. While the world is still grappling with the pandemic aftermath, we are already experiencing devastating extreme weather events such as wildfires, floods, storms, rapid biodiversity loss, and the destruction of ecosystems, which accelerates social inequalities and directly endanger human existence on the planet. Against this backdrop, it is increasingly crucial to strengthen the dialogue between academia, industry practitioners, and the policymakers. So in this context, robust and high-quality academic research is fundamental to ensuring that the policy and the market actors are empowered to make science-based decisions. Additionally, we want to emphasize that only by fostering diversity and inclusion in academia can we drive scientific innovation and tackle complex environmental and social problems for that reason. So we strive to bring together a diverse community to promote an open exchange of ideas and knowledge sharing during this high-level virtual conference. Yesterday, GRASFI PhD workshop was successfully held. Ahead of us are 3 days full of insightful discussions and presentations with the participation of the world's experts in sustainable finance. This year's GRASFI program includes keynote speeches from leading academics and practitioners, 2 high-level panel discussions on central banks and regulators and emerging markets finance. We have also planned 13 paper sessions featuring 39 excellent papers on climate and biodiversity finance, green bonds, financial regulations, and so on. I hope this year's GRASFI conference will inspire you future work with cutting-edge research, build friendships for future collaborations, and give you the confidence to push the frontiers of knowledge in sustainable finance. Together, we can accelerate the alignment of the financial system with climate and biodiversity needs and drive the momentum for the 2 upcoming COPs in Glasgow and Kunming. Okay, I'm stopped here. Thank you very much. Chris.
Thank you, Wang Yao. So good to see you, and so good to hear your welcoming remarks. Next, please give a warm welcome also to Dr. Ben Caldecott. Ben is the founding director of the Oxford Sustainable Finance Program at the University of Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and is also the founding director and principal investigator of the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investments, established by the UK Research and Innovation in 2021 as the International Center to accelerate the adoption and use of climate and environmental data by financial institutions. Since 2019, he has also been seconded to the UK Cabinet Office as the COP26 Strategy Advisor for Finance. And of course, I think most of us know Ben also as the chair of the GRASFI board. Welcome, Ben.
Welcome to GRASFI 2021, the 4th annual conference of the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment. I'm Ben Caldecott from Oxford University, and I'm one of the co-founders of GRASFI. I'm also its co-chair, together with Professor Rob Bauer of Maastricht University. As a result of the pandemic, the board, together with CUFI, this year's host university, decided to move to a fully online conference for the 2nd time. I want to commend the CUFI team for putting this together and for your willingness to participate remotely. Before we get going, I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a bit more about the Alliance. The Alliance was founded in 2017. We now have 29 member universities representing a wide range of major global and regional research universities. The University of Bologna, the oldest extant university in the world, and the University of Edinburgh, famous for Adam Smith, amongst other things, are the latest universities to join GRASFI, and they've both recently joined. Both have demonstrated a significant long-term commitment to research and teaching in sustainable finance, like all of our member universities. Now, as an alliance, we decided early on that a top priority must be to deliver a high-quality international academic conference every year, the go-to conference for all researchers in our emerging field. There are already many practitioner-focused conferences with academic researchers present, but very few for academics to come together and for academic discourse and field development to be the primary focus. So our annual conferences are first and foremost academic conferences for academics. We have agreed, however, that it's obviously important to have practitioners present, and around 25% of the participants are practitioners, represent regulators or NGOs working on these topics, many of whom have connections to universities and academic research programs. These are obviously key research partners and provide really important perspectives for our research. Please do provide feedback during and after the conference. We'll be undertaking an initial review of what's worked this year at our AGM, and the feedback will be invaluable for the organisers of next year's conference. And I'm pleased to confirm that next year it'll be the University of Zurich, and that will be from the 1st to the 3rd of September. In Zurich in Switzerland, so please put the date in your diary. So to conclude, our growing community of academic researchers working on sustainable finance needs to be here for the long haul. The Alliance has been established to support this and to encourage a flourishing of impactful, high-quality research on sustainable finance and investment. The quality of the papers reviewed for this conference suggests there is continued rapid growth in sustainable finance research, and now an impressive pipeline of PhD students wanting to build careers in this field. It's an incredibly exciting time. So much is going on, and we have a unique opportunity to shape this field of academic research. So finally, on behalf of the board, I want to thank our sponsors, our main conference sponsor, BNP Paribas Asset Management, our paper prize sponsor, the CFA Institute Financial Analyst Journal. And I also want to thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful conference and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was very warm, very nice welcome also from your side. Next, please give a warm welcome to Professor Rob Bauer, the chair of the academic committee of the GRASFI 2021 conference. Rob Bauer is professor of finance, the chair at Maastricht University School of Business and Economics in the Netherlands. Rob is also director of the European Center for Corporate Engagement at Maastricht University and executive director of the International Center for Pension Management in Toronto. Over to you, Rob.
Yes, thank you, Christoph. I actually am jointly with Ben, the co-chair and co-founders of with Maastricht University and Oxford of GRASFI. So I think I want to go back a minute to when we started what we wanted to achieve. And one important point that we want to achieve in these conferences is that we come up with research that has impact. And research that has impact is not just research that is interesting and has great results, but it's also thorough research, checked for right methodology, that you can infer something to really make sure that that the paper
It seems, Rob, that's kind of the problem of beauty of live conferences, global live conferences. Rob is not available right now. I think we had some issues before. Rob, are you back with us?
I'm back, yes. Oh, I really don't know what's going on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. No, we cannot hear you. I think until we figure this out, we will move to our next round, and hopefully Rob will join us later again when the connection is more stable. I want to move then, take the opportunity to move to the keynote speeches. Rob, you will be joining later, hopefully again, to the keynote speeches. And I'm absolutely excited about kind of the mix that we have gathered and the fantastic speakers that we could invite to this conference. We have financial sector experts to deliver keynote speeches, and I'm particularly excited about this, also the short lightning speeches delivered by non-financial experts, but so actual scientists concerned with climate change, biodiversity, and social development to help us understand in the community what actually sustainable and green means in the finance sector. Now, with that, I'm absolutely excited to introduce our first lightning keynote speaker, Emily Schuckberg. Dr. Emily Schuckberg is the director of the Cambridge Zero, the University of Cambridge Major Climate Change Initiative. She's also a reader in environmental data science at the Department of Computer Science and Technology and leads the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training on the application of AI to the study of environmental risks. She's a mathematician and climate scientist and a fellow of Darwin College, a fellow of the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership, an associate fellow of the Center for Science and Policy, a fellow of the British Antarctic Survey, and a fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society. A warm welcome to you, Emily.
Today, I'd like to talk about the urgency of the climate change response. We are seeing the impacts of climate change in extreme weather around the world. Wildfires, heat waves, floods, the melting of polar ice. Climate change really is here and now today. And today's atmosphere is unprecedented in terms of the levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases throughout human history, prehistory, and beyond. We know this from the evidence from Antarctic ice cores. If we look at a dashboard of how the world has changed over the last 150 years, society has been transformed in many countries of the world, a 100-fold increase in global GDP. And much of that transformation has been driven by industrialization, powered by the use of fossil fuels, a 20-fold increase in global energy use. Fossil fuels produce greenhouse gases, and that has led to a warming of the world, a 1.1 degree Celsius increase in global temperatures, and other changes to the climate system, including rising sea levels. And this is all sat on top of a wider threat to nature. So collectively, we are facing both a climate and a nature emergency. Climate change is threatening lives and livelihoods around the world. And at the same time, around 1 million species are estimated as being at risk of extinction over the coming decades. The scale of change that we are inflicting on the planet is shocking. Tropical forest area, almost the size of England, was lost in 2019, with a third of that being primary forest. If we don't limit our impact on the planet, the risks to people, nature, and business will multiply as the warming increases. And just as one example, this is a plot, a graph showing the increase expected in the number of business disruption days over the coming decades as a consequence of an increase in warming, with extreme heat days expected in many, many countries of the world. And perhaps the biggest concern is the risk of catastrophic shocks occurring as the planet warms. That might be the collapse of the vast ice sheets covering Greenland and Antarctica. It might be the switch of the Amazon rainforest from being a sink of carbon to being a source of carbon, or it might be the release of vast stores of frozen methane from the Arctic as it warms. Now, if we're to limit the risk of those climate impacts, we need to dramatically change our emissions of greenhouse gases. This graph here shows our global emissions of carbon dioxide over the last 4 decades in white dots, and the pathway we need to be on if we are to have a reasonable chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It requires halving our global emissions over this decade and reaching net zero by around about the middle of the century. But within that, there are huge opportunities for transformational change. We're already on a pathway to a green energy future. We can see the future in terms of net zero transport, with electric vehicles rapidly increasing around the world. Agriculture can be made more sustainable. We can reduce our waste and create more circular economy. Buildings can be constructed and operated in zero carbon ways. We can look at industrial processes and how we can green those. And we can look to see how we can use technology and nature to remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So, of course, there are significant risks to businesses and investments from climate change, whether that's transition risk, physical risk, or liability risk. But all of those risks can be turned around into opportunities, clean growth opportunities, the opportunity to build greater resilience, and the opportunity to indeed revision our entire mission in terms of our businesses and investments. How can our business and investments be used to support a better future for all? So in summary, climate change is here and now. The global response to date is not sufficient. Everyone has to do more. The next 10 years are critical, but this really does represent the investment opportunity of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. I think very sobering, a strong wake-up call for immediate action, but also a clear pathway to look at some of the opportunities. Next, I would like to welcome Stephen Billiet. He's the CEO of APAC and head of Global Client Group at BNP Paribas Asset Management. Stephen is armed with considerable experience in the asset management and financial services industry, It's a career spans, it's hard to believe, but 27 years, of which 18 years as chief executive officers roles at business entities of global organizations in Australia, Hong Kong, India, Singapore, and Taiwan. As the head of Global Client Group, he's instrumental in spearheading the firm's business development strategy to become a leading provider of quality investments solutions for individual, corporate, and institutional investors, while maintaining focus on delivering sustainable return for clients in line with BNP Paribas Asset Management's core values and culture. A very, very warm welcome to you, Stephen. Can you unmute yourself? I think, or somebody can unmute him.
Is that okay now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, Christopher, and it's great to be here. And thank you all for joining the conference. And clearly at BNP Paribas Asset Management, it's our pleasure to be sponsoring this event. We have been supporting GRASFI since the start because it aligns very well with our overall aim to be a future maker and using the leverage that our investments and our voice bring to positively influence the world around us. So it's very much aligned with that commitment, and we feel indeed that promoting cutting-edge research in sustainable finance and investment is a stepping stone for a more sustainable future. Issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and social inequality, emerging academic research and hosting academic interns in our organization, we feel will help us address those risks. And it will also help us solve complex issues, such as how to measure the social and environmental impact of investments. The Paris Climate Change Agreement, the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the IIGF biodiversity targets post-2020 are the frameworks that have set us all on a common path to transform life, hopefully, for everyone. But the global finance industry has a massive role to play in the drive to bring about this economic and societal change that we're all here to discuss at the GRASFI conference. BNP Paribas Asset Management, as a committed sustainable investor, integrates ESG factors into our decision making, and that's at the core of what we really do every day. Through BNP Paribas Asset Management's sustainable strategy, we've committed to take a firm-wide approach to sustainable investment across all of our assets and asset classes. So how does a large investment organization such as ourselves address this complicated problem in a way that fosters genuine sustainability? I think we, as a large global investor, and many of our colleagues in the industry have accepted the realities that a sustainable world and shifting capital is needed to make the transition. Embedding the management of carbon into investing practice, for example, or engaging with companies in which we invest through constructive dialogue will help us to encourage them to follow a more sustainable path. Achieving net zero emissions has really now become the new benchmark, and we've seen that around the world, but also in Asia, growing commitments towards that goal, with also China last year announcing it would target carbon neutrality by 2060. And those commitments, as well as the ones made at the Leaders Summit on Climate earlier this year, and the additional statements from the US government, I think have now really boosted momentum in this net zero initiative. And the finance industry is definitely following that, with more than 30 global managers, asset managers, saying that they would aim to achieve this net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and I think about 43 banks now also announcing plans to cut emissions from their balance sheets. So that's on the finance industry itself, but also the financial regulators are playing a key role in driving better standards of corporate behavior. And regulators now want to see companies come up with meaningful, achievable targets on climate and sustainability. So now the pressure, I think, is building on companies to become more transparent in their financial disclosures, and lobby groups are pushing for votes against the election of directors, for instance, who fail to support sustainable goals. Investors wanting to cut the carbon emission intensity of their investments are also working more closely with index providers and other industry players to devise passive investment strategies tied to customized client transition indices. And all of these moves will bring significant improvements in sustainable investing. And as time goes on, we should also be able to start to accurately measure those improvements. Now, while the pressure builds on companies to comply and to report, the challenge for investors is to gain meaningful insight from corporate ESG reporting. And although there's an increasing number of companies that publish sustainability reports, they do not systematically include quantified, standardized information or meaningful data for investors. So metrics disclosed are often based on inconsistent methodologies, and that obviously limits comparability and increases the potential of misuse or misunderstanding. But so the collective endeavors there amongst investors, including passive investors, is definitely the key to changing that behavior. And amidst all the new complexity of sustainability reporting, good communication will remain critical. It's important that companies and big investors clearly and transparently tell the community what steps they're taking to meet the sustainable development goals. At BNP Paribas Asset Management, we've been a leader in that sustainable investment philosophy, and it's clearly something that we feel has been recognized globally. We're top ranked amongst major asset managers for our responsible investment approach in Share Action's Point of No Returns report. And in 2019, we became the first global manager to commit to integrate sustainable investment across the full range of our strategies. In our principles of sustainable investment latest assessment report, the BNP Paribas Asset Management received a top A+ rating in 5 out of the 7 modules, including for strategy and governance modules. So we're very much dedicated to sustainable investing and get recognition there from external parties. What we do as an active shareholder as well is really to take stock on a regular basis on how we vote, in particular on issues around climate change, on board diversity, for instance, as focus areas. And we can sort of report on that as well. We have, for the 2021 season of general meetings, opposed 34% of resolutions, which is a rate that has been increasing year after year. We also opposed to 700 resolutions specifically for climate reasons. And these were cases where companies were just not properly reporting on their carbon footprint, or didn't communicate or want to engage constructively on mitigating and adapting to climate change. And so the growth in climate-related resolutions filed by shareholders like ourselves show that we've reached a major turning point in how companies are run. Climate and sustainability are now top of the agenda, and we expect that to continue to rise and have an impact on general meetings at companies for years to come. So engagement can be a powerful tool to drive sustainable change, and that engagement needs to intensify, because ultimately companies will have to be divested if they cannot demonstrate a willingness or an ability to transition. But engagement and disclosures are not just going to deliver the targets. The next decade, we feel, is going to be dominated by portfolio investment decisions. Investors need to be better informed on the impact of their decisions. Just as an example, biodiversity impact is currently not perceived by the market as a material risk, and as a result, investors still hold assets with high biodiversity risk and impact in their portfolios. So the complexity of this problem really highlights why it's important for policymakers and investors to precisely map and quantify and analyze the environmental and social impact of their activities. Creating investable assets, bonds, and funds that can be directed at the problem is also key to unlocking a sustainable future channeling capital to green technologies and infrastructure. As the market deepens for sustainable linked loans and green bonds, we can also expect to see most radical changes in areas such as climate resilient infrastructure, renewable energy, electric transport, digital agriculture, for example. Moving maybe on to more geographical topics. So China also has an important role to play, and it's working to mobilize a massive green investment program. The People's Bank of China plans to develop a mandatory disclosure system that will require all financial institutions and firms to follow a uniform disclosure methodology. It's working with the European Union to harmonize green taxonomies. And recently, this year, in April, the Chinese authorities issued an updated catalog of economic activities eligible to be financed by green bonds. It completely excludes coal and other fossil fuels from green activities, even clean use of such fuels. So this is a clear signal of China's policy intention to direct capital raised from green bonds to support the transition away from fossil fuels towards low carbon projects. And China accounts for about a third of the world's CO2 emissions. So if China can live up to this promise to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, it will have contributed significantly to global change in this space. According to the latest Convention of Biological Diversity report, it costs about over 100 billion and about 895 billion annually to support the global biodiversity framework. So these figures are, big, but they're dwarfed by the current financial flows into activities which harm biodiversity. So, particularly the incentives in agriculture, fossil fuels, and fisheries. So preserving biodiversity and restoring ecosystems really represents a very large investment opportunity. And according to the World Economic Forum, business opportunities from aquatic, terrestrial, and urban ecosystem restoration amount to no less than 60 trillion in the decade to 2030. So that's a massive opportunity for institutional capital to be used in a very supportive way. And so the momentum is building, and that's the good news. Global investments are following one or more of the sustainable investment approaches, and they've grown a lot to now about 35 trillion in professionally managed assets, which is about 30% of all the assets across the US, Canada, Japan, Australasia, and Europe. So with these numbers, there's still a lot of promising progress, but we feel that there's still too much of vague policy making, greenwashing, and inconsistency in reporting or responsible investing standards. So the trend for sustainable investing is gathering pace, and institutional investors and wealthy families have started to recognize thematic investment opportunities such as renewables, and are putting more emphasis on thematic investments such as alternative energy and the broader energy transition themes. And as a result, alternative energies is poised to benefit from the massive investments needed for the transition to a Paris-aligned economic model. Global pledges to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 have opened up renewable energy and infrastructure opportunities for investors. Demand is strong for large-scale wind and solar power assets and hydrogen alternatives and anything related to climate tech. For example, the power generation in Asia accounts still for almost a quarter of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And so to replace that as part of the move towards net zero shows the opportunities that it can create for the overall renewable sector, as well as for the broader infrastructure that supports it. So ultimately, there's still little doubt that the energy transition will shape economies going forward, and investor appetite is clearly an evidence of this, with the trend towards ESG solutions riding on growing environmental awareness that also has accelerated during the COVID pandemic. And this is supported by observable changes around the world. A recent survey by Boston Consulting Group, for instance, found that 70% of respondents now are more interested in environmental challenges and are more committed to changing their own behavior, to advance sustainability. And so in line with this, investment in ESG funds hit an all-time high in 2020 with 347 billion of inflows and 700 new funds launched globally. And that's not only in the rest of the world, also in Asia, we're catching up with now 37 billion in assets under management across sustainable funds at the end of 2020, which is a rise from about 20 billion only 6 months before. So it is a lot of change, but we still feel it falls short of the required estimate investments of potentially more than 3 trillion to achieve global climate goals. So growth has been strong, but from a very low base, and there's still a lot of room for more growth in this space. So meeting broad and effective sustainability targets will continue to require huge changes to the global economy in terms of energy mix, consumption, housing, human behavior in general. So it's vital that the largest investing institutions globally, like ourselves, do all they can to help society evolve in positive ways, and that will ensure a more sustainable future. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a fantastic conference ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. I think that you covered a lot of ground in your speech, gave a lot of hope also in the direction that we're going, a lot of support also in the research that we should embark on. I think you highlighted also particularly biodiversity, where solutions are wanting, but are being developed as we are speaking. We just had also concluded the biodiversity side event of GRASFI with one of your colleagues participating as well. So thank you again for joining, and thank you so much for your support. Next, I would like to welcome our speaker for the next lightning keynote speech on social development, Cobus van Staden. Cobus van Staden is a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He's focusing on Africa-China relations at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He's also the co-host on the China and Africa podcast, listen in if you don't, and the director of research and analysis at the China Africa project. Very, very warm welcome to you, Cobus.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cobus van Staden. I'm a researcher on China and Africa relations at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and I also run a project called the China Africa Project, where we focus on the entire breadth of China's engagement in the Global South, and particularly in Africa. So I'm incredibly honored to have been invited to deliver this message to the GRASFI conference. It's really amazing to speak with all of you. Christoph asked me to particularly comment on the social impact of sustainable financing. So just to give you an idea of the kind of context within which I'm speaking, I'm South African. I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg. As you no doubt saw a few months ago, South Africa was overrun by violent protests and widespread looting, which really put a dent to the national economy, an economy that's already been dented by a lot of corruption and by the COVID-19 pandemic. So South Africa this week released new unemployment numbers, which puts it in it now has the highest unemployment numbers in the world. So this is this kind of slow-moving wildfire. It's a slow-moving train wreck in the country. It's incredibly destructive. It's incredibly worrying. And this is exactly the kind of thing that sustainable financing and that the experts that work on it should consider. You know, when we talk about social inclusion, we tend to think a lot about skills transfer. We tend to think a lot about training, and those things are really important. It is important to create jobs. It's important to train people, and the more internationally financed projects can do that, the better. But what we're looking at to solve this issue is a lot more radical. We need to to find new ways of engaging the community with particularly young people. So Africa, as everyone knows, Africa has a very young population. And the average age of an African is around 19. So think of yourself at 19. Think of the kind of things that you wanted to do, the things the places you wanted to enter. And I hazard a guess that many people listening to this, kind of had some access to spaces of education, of employment, to internships, to kind of ways to make those first steps kind of going forward. Young people in South Africa don't have that access, and no one is really stepping up to give them that access. And this is even more true in other parts of Africa. So, kind of what we've seen in South Africa is that there's a limit to how long people can just absorb exclusion. It's, kind of at some stage it blows up. And when it does, it takes whole chunks of the economy with it. The chaos in South Africa was, in international coverage of it was ascribed to leadership issues in the government and different groups of kind of being loyal to the previous president and to the current president, and that is true. However, it's been growing and gaining momentum for decades and decades. The real thing that caused the chaos wasn't necessarily the particular kind of political issues of the day, but it was the structural exclusion of large parts of the population. And the way that they are excluded is by simply not getting any chances, like not getting any stakeholdership, not getting any new skills. So this is what we need to think about in sustainable financing going forward. Not only how can we maximize skills transfer, how can we maximize the involvement in local employment and local procurement, but we need to think much wider and much more kind of in a much more radical way about how can we stop this kind of slow moving wildfire that's consuming global South societies, and how can we make the best use of this incredible amount of human capital that's kind of currently kind of rolling around with no destination. When people's talents are used, they can achieve amazing things. When they're not used, the kind of degradation and kind of personal disempowerment that comes with it tends to poison everything, even those talents. And it certainly tends to then poison the societies where these people live. And they tend to then cause ongoing knock-on problems because people can only live so long in a certain place without hope before they decide to move. And the next step is, is racism in Europe, et cetera, right? Kind of so all of these systems are enmeshed and they're all woven together. And it is the responsibility of people like us who work in international development, international finance, to find ways of solving this problem, because this is as big a problem as climate change, for example, right? Kind of, and with climate change, we're now used to thinking that, well, what we need to do, among other things, is massive institutional reform. The way that we do business on all kind of counts, on, in agriculture, in making cement, in, kind of transportation, all of these things have to change in order for us to make it through climate change semi-intact. The same is true for social inclusion and for social investment. Without adequate social investment, all of our other mitigation measures, including in climate change, including in health, including in education even, will go to waste. Because the way that a lack of inclusion, the way that it kind of rewires societies, and the way that the kind of logics that it supports, including kind of corruption and other forms of kind of scarcity logics, end up making the implementation of other mitigation measures impossible. So this is what we have to think about. Like, we have to find a way of including these people, like finding ways of redefining what value through work means, redefining what employment looks like, and kind of and starting to think in really radical, innovative ways about how to move forward, taking everyone with us. So thanks so much. Enjoy the conference. Thanks so much for this invitation. I'm thrilled to be able to contribute this message. And yes, thanks so much. And I look forward to speaking soon.
Kobus, thank you so much. That was a very inspiring, heartbreaking, but also very important speech. I think with sustainable finance focusing on the triple bottom line, not just economic returns, this speech really highlights the social stress. Also, of course, some opportunities that we in the sustainable finance research and business community have to ensure to include. A true witness story. Next, I would like to welcome for our next keynote speech, Ms. Armida Salcia Aliziabana. She's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, also known as UNESCO. Ms. Armida Salcia Aliziabana was appointed Executive Secretary of UNESCO in September 2018. Since 2016, she has served as Director for the Center of Sustainable Development Goal Studies at Universidad Padjadjaran, sorry for the mispronunciation, and Vice Chair of the Indonesian Academy of Sciences. From 2009 to 2014, she was Minister of National Development Planning and the head of the National Development Planning Agency in Indonesia. The floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to join you here at the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment 2021 conference. I would like to thank the International Institute of Green Finance of the Central University of Finance and Economics for hosting this important event. Aligning financial markets with environmental, social, and governance criteria is essential in addressing the daunting challenge faced by climate change. Concrete actions, including the financing of green and sustainable solutions, have never been more urgent. As countries prioritize a speedy economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a risk that financial flows are diverted from sustainable finance initiatives. It is paramount that sustainable finance remains a top priority both for government and businesses as we work towards economic recovery. At ESCAP, we are supporting our member states through data gathering, research, capacity building, and technical assistance to institute policies, mechanisms, and procedures that would assist the transition to a low-carbon future. There are several innovative financing strategies and mechanisms which we are advocating, including the issuance of thematic bonds, specifically green bonds. There already has been a substantial rise in the issuance of thematic bonds in recent years. However, the lack of a clear framework and associated policies for issuing green bonds remains a significant barrier. Therefore, it is important that countries adopt recognized international standards and green bond frameworks, such as the Green Bond Principles. It is equally important to establish methodologies to verify the environmental and social impacts of the projects financed by such bonds. Similarly, climate risk disclosure and reporting are also critical. Incentivizing investors and businesses to factor in climate risk in their decision-making allows financial flows to align with climate objectives. Additionally, alternative innovative financing instruments, such as debt for climate swaps, have the potential to help simultaneously tackle challenges related to insufficient financial flows for climate action and debt sustainability. However, facilitating such a swap is complex. ESCAP is working with partners to analyze and identify the fundamental characteristics of success in negotiating such a swap. In closing, it is heartening to see such a robust coalition of academic research institutions alongside policymakers and the private sector. I hope this conference will inspire debate, peer learning, and action. Additionally, as this event brings together university scholars, who will become future experts on sustainable finance. I hope this event inspires our youth to innovate, take action, and become the leaders and climate champions of tomorrow. I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Armida. Thank you for your warm message. It's well received. And I also believe that it's not only, of course, the experts already in the field, but also the youth that has to be mobilized in order to become experts in the sustainable finance field. Next, I would like to welcome Vitor Gaspar. He's the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Since 2014. He was also Portuguese Minister of State and Finance from 2011 to 2013 and has held various positions in European and Portuguese institutions, including head of BIPA at the European Commission, Director General of Research at the European Central Bank, Director of Economic Studies and Statistics at the Central Bank of Portugal, and Director of Economic Studies at the Portuguese Ministry of Finance. A very warm welcome to you, Vitor.
Good morning or good afternoon. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to contribute to the 4th annual conference of the Global Research Alliance for Finance and Investment, GRASFI. And I am Vitor Gaspar from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. In this presentation, I will start by giving the motivation of why climate change is macro critical for the International Monetary Fund. How do we see the policy response to climate change with an emphasis on carbon pricing, but looking at complementarities between carbon pricing and other instruments. The third part of the presentation would be on the political economy of policies to fight climate change, the aspect of enhancing acceptability. I'm unlikely to have time to cover that section, and then I will conclude. Now, the starting point is well known to all participants in this conference. And what we see is a chart from the Oxford Environmental Change Institute that shows in blue that the balance between natural warming and cooling would lead to a very flat path for temperatures on average worldwide. But that's not what we have been observing. What we have been observing is a steady increase, and we see that the dominant driver of this trend is human activities on Earth. So that's our starting point. Now, this global warming has been associated with headlines reporting on extreme weather events, and there is suggestive evidence that the incidence of extreme weather events is related to global warming, and I will elaborate a little bit more on this later on. I will spend a little bit more time on this slide, and I really ask for your attention because I do believe it's an important point. I want to make 5 points, I believe. The first is very obvious. If you look at the left-hand side, you do see that the impacts of a 3.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature is associated with an estimated and simulated decline in GDP per capita, and that effect cumulates over time. So climate change is adverse to economic performance. On the right-hand side, you see that that's not the only problem. Another important problem is that the incidence of this economic costs falls more heavily on the poorest segments of the population, while the richest are actually able to cope reasonably well with the impacts from climate change in these simulations. Now, clearly, a second aspect, which is very clear from the left-hand side of the slide, is that the uncertainty associated with the impacts of climate change is very high. We're not very precise in our estimates of consequences from climate change on GDP per capita. And of course, the aspects that were reflected in these simulations are basically impacts through the path of productivity growth, investment accumulation, and other economic variables. The fact that these models do not take into account possible tipping points in the equilibrium of natural environments suggests that the amount of uncertainty, huge as it is a very strong underestimate. And this point about uncertainty is crucial. The third point that I want to make is that, as it was clear from the first slide that I presented, the link between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming is not controversial, and the models that we have to represent this relation have proven quite accurate. However, it does seem that the models that do relate increases in temperature with the incidence of extreme weather effects may have actually underestimated the impacts of increase in temperature on the weather, and in particular, extreme weather effects. So again, uncertainty is pervasive, and it is likely to be even more important. This is a radical change. It is a systemic change, and so it is necessary to model explicitly both the impacts on economic and finance, and also continue research on the initial process of global warming and its propagation through the various relevant natural environments. So moving now on, we see that business as usual is not going to enable us to fight and limit climate change. On the contrary, things would get substantially worse. We see that the national defined contributions in the climate agreement would lead to a substantial decline in CO2 emissions, but not any place near what is necessary to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and even further away from 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the main point from this slide is a different one. You see clearly from the slide that the type of adjustment that we will have to undertake in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years is quite pronounced. And the sooner we get to net zero, the sooner we're going to be able to contain global warming, and the more we are going to be able to control the process of climate change. And you see in this chart that if you group countries into advanced economies, emerging market economies, and low-income countries, you see that the participation of emerging market economies in any global effort is crucial for effectiveness in the fight against climate change. Without the mobilization of emerging market economies, the efforts, say, by advanced economies alone would be dramatically insufficient. More on this to follow. Now, given the radical change that we are talking about, a change in technological paradigm is necessary, and that involves the diffusion of existing commercial proven technologies. And you have an illustration on the chart on the right-hand side of the chart. And of course, the fusion of existing commercial proven low carbon technologies is going to be decisive for what's going to happen from now until 2030. As we widen the time horizon, new technologies become increasingly important, and incentives for innovation also. And that clearly underlines the importance of carbon pricing, as carbon pricing facilitates both the adoption of existing technologies, but also nudges innovation and research and development expenditure towards new, greener technologies that are crucial for a successful transition. Now, there are good examples of success stories, and the example of phasing out of coal in the United Kingdom is one such an example. In the case of the United Kingdom, there was a moderate carbon price that was adopted. There was a carbon price floor, and that carbon price floor, as you can see on the right-hand side, pushed the carbon price above the level that prevailed in Europe in general. And as you can see on the lower panel, also on the right-hand side, the contribution of coal to the production of energy was lowered from 42% in 2012 to 7% in 2017. And this is quite remarkable given that we're talking about 5 years. And that does show the power of carbon pricing to accelerate the transition. Now, this slide is one that we, from the International Monetary Fund, have shown many times. You know now from the first slide that we are already about 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The range in the Paris Agreement is in yellow, between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. In order to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we need a carbon tax of $75 per ton by 2030 or equivalent. In order to limit to 1.5, we need to go even further. Again, you immediately perceive that we're talking about radical transformation. How can we bring it about? To our mind, carbon pricing is at the center of the instruments that are most promising. And you can see in this slide that we have already 30 national schemes around the world. There are good examples of recent adoption, but the global average price per ton is only $3 per ton, and the coverage of the schemes is also substantially less than what we would advise. Carbon pricing not only has impacts on the climate change dynamics, but has quite substantial impacts on other sustainable development goals, and the impact that it has on other sustainable development goals operates to its impact on development and its impact on public finances. We have looked at this issue in reasonable detail, as you can guess from this slide, but we simply do not have time to go through the details, but the details matter. The details are very important. Now, carbon pricing is necessary, but definitely not sufficient in many sectors. For example, transports and buildings. Other instruments are necessary. For example, the carbon price, which would be necessary to achieve Germany's emission reduction targets for transports and buildings, would be about $180 per ton, and that would be above the range of estimates that have been put forward as reasonable for carbon prices or carbon taxation. So complementary instruments are necessary. These complementary instruments can be standards and regulations. The fund has investigated the impacts of fee-baits that allow one to keep the incentives at the margin while reducing the incidence on households and corporations. Public investment is extremely important, and we have studied it both in the Fiscal Monitor and the World Economic Outlook. The liberalization of energy markets and the reliance of a market mechanism is very important. But in order to buy political consensus and contribute to a just transition, it is important to look at distributional impacts of the various policy instruments used and correct the unwanted effects from the climate change policies. Now, we have been arguing that the carbon price is not only an important instrument at the level of each individual countries, it's actually a very important instrument for international coordination, because it is transparent and easy to monitor, and it allows the concentration of negotiations on a single dimension. So a carbon price floor by major emitters would go an extremely long way towards a global approach to fighting climate change. Now, emerging market economies would have strong incentives to join such an agreement, because they're affected by the global externality, because a global cooperative approach helps in ensuring that there are no disturbances to world trade, and that a border carbon adjustment can be limited or even avoided. The local externalities associated with the greenhouse gas emissions are very large in some of the dominant emerging market economies, but there is also the possibility of financial incentives for emerging market participation, and of course the revenues associated with carbon pricing would help in this direction. As I feared, I do not have time to go through the political economy aspects of the reform. In order to get it, carbon pricing needs to be complemented by many instruments that I've only referred to in passing, but the slides with some interesting details will be available for your perusal. And I conclude. I try to persuade you that carbon pricing is a core policy instrument for mitigation strategies at the national level. Now, I've also argued that carbon pricing is a good way to foster international cooperation and a global approach to climate change. Our estimates point that a global carbon price at around $75 by 2030 is necessary to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. But carbon taxes, carbon prices are not all. We need a comprehensive strategy that encompasses other instruments, including standards and regulations. We have also emphasized the importance of fee-based. Following such a comprehensive instrument, such a comprehensive strategy based on a range of instruments is even more necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The additional revenue should be used to promote inclusive growth and gather social and political support. A low-carbon society does provide local benefits, and those local benefits make carbon pricing in the country's own best interest, even if considered in isolation. And coming from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund, the conclusion that I want to emphasize the most is that a solid fiscal groundwork is the foundation to build forward better. Thank you so much for your attention.
Vitor, Gaspar, thank you so much for this very, very in-depth description of, first of all, where we are in terms of the climate impacts on our economy, and of course also on the instruments that we can apply and their effectiveness to mitigate climate risks. Thank you so much for that. Next up, also a very exciting and important speech, a lightning speech by Terry Townsend, a fellow at the Paulson Institute and a Beijing-based wildlife conservationist with a background in environmental economics and environmental law. He's a fellow of the Paulson Institute and in 2020 co-authored, and I think many of you have read this report, the groundbreaking study called Financing Nature, Closing the Biodiversity Finance Gap. So very excited to have you here. Terry, you are going to give us a lightning speech on the biodiversity aspects that we have to consider as the sustainable finance specialist. A very warm welcome to you, Terry.
Well, thank you, Christoph, and thank you to GRASFI for the invitation to speak at the opening of this important event. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope you can all see that. So I suspect that when most people think of sustainable finance, they think of investment in low carbon energy, goods and services in order to tackle climate change, and that's reasonable. However, there is another environmental crisis that, although it's not receiving as much attention as yet, it is growing and has the potential to be an even bigger threat to human prosperity. And that issue is, of course, biodiversity loss. And just to outline the scale of what we have done and what we are doing to nature, here are a few facts.
So in the last 50 years, it's estimated, which is in the blink of an eye, in evolutionary terms, it's estimated that the populations of vertebrates have fallen by an average of 68%. And the extinction rate of species is estimated to be up to 1,000 times the natural rate. And today it's estimated that around 70% of all the birds in the world are chickens, and 96% of all mammals are humans or the livestock on which we rely for food. And if we continue on this trajectory, we face a future where between 30 and 50% of all species may be lost by the middle of this century. And although research into the risks of biodiversity loss is way behind that of climate change, there is increasing evidence that biodiversity loss presents tremendous risks to human prosperity. And I'd like to highlight two specific risks. The first is economic. So our economy, of course, relies on nature and the services it provides. And one small example, which is often cited, that's relatively easy to quantify, is the value of our pollinators. And that's the bats, the birds, the insects, including bees, that we rely on to pollinate our crops. And if we were to lose these, and we're well on the way to doing so through our overuse of pesticides, it would cost the global economy more than $200 billion US. And that is one tiny example. And for every value that we can measure in terms of nature's services, there are many, many more that we cannot. But what is clear is the scale of our reliance on nature. So a recent study by the World Economic Forum estimated that $44 trillion US, which is over half of the global economy, is highly or moderately dependent on nature. And of course, ultimately, all economic activity depends on clean air, clean water, and a habitable climate. Now, the second risk is public health. So there's growing scientific evidence to show that biodiversity loss puts people into contact with stressed ecosystems in a way that increases the risk of transmission of zoonotic diseases. And it's probably no coincidence that in the last few decades of rapid biodiversity loss, we've seen the emergence of SARS, MERS, Ebola, and of course SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus responsible for COVID-19, and the devastation that that has wreaked across the world. And it is likely that as we understand more about the complexity of nature and the magnitude of the risks, we may realize that biodiversity loss, in fact, presents risks on an even greater scale than climate change. And of course, as with most risks we face in life, the rational response is to hedge. And in the case of biodiversity loss, that means a comprehensive worldwide effort to appropriately value, protect, and restore nature. Now, some people say, hang on, let's focus on one thing at a time. When we fixed our policies on climate change, we can then focus on biodiversity loss. But that would be a mistake. Not only is the biodiversity crisis urgent, but climate policies could, if not well planned, exacerbate biodiversity risks. So just to give two examples, we all want to see a transition to clean energy. However, clean energy infrastructure has a land footprint that is up to 12 times larger than traditional energy. And a recent report from TNC suggests that clean energy infrastructure is actually the biggest threat to pristine habitat in North America. And second, there are now many countries around the world committing to carbon neutrality, most notably, of course, China's recent commitment to reach net zero by 2060. Undoubtedly, this is going to require a lot of offsets. And one of the most popular ways to offset emissions is to plant trees. Now, planting trees is good, right? Well, not necessarily. Tree planting, if it's not well planned, has the potential to harm biodiversity if trees are planted on grasslands or wetlands, which are valuable ecosystems and carbon sinks in their own right. And there are plenty of cases where trees have been planted on any open space, resulting in loss of biodiversity. But the good news is that with careful planning, we can tackle climate change and biodiversity loss together. Now, I want to end with this, which is just a growing body of evidence about the biodiversity risks. Christoph mentioned the Financing Nature report by the Paulson Institute and TNC and Cornell University. There are others too, the Dasgupta review into the economics of biodiversity from the UK government, the UNEP WEF report, Economics of Land Degradation, and also nature risk rising. And just as many countries and companies are planning to align with the Paris Agreement, it will be necessary also to align with the Kunming Agreement, which is due to be finalized at the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity COP15 in China next year. So I think I'll end there and hand back to you, Christoph. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. Again, really highlighting the urgency of addressing also the biodiversity aspect in green finance. So thank you so much. It's obviously some very sobering data as well on the biodiversity, the necessity to include biodiversity into financial decision making. Now, a slight change in program, also to stay not to fall not too far behind. Barbara Buchner's speech will be available online on demand, and I would like to give the floor now to Rob Bauer to share some more remarks, particularly on the academic side of the conference.
Yes, thank you, Christoph. This is my second try. I tried at the beginning of this session, didn't work. Maybe because of the floods we had in the Netherlands. I'm in the epicenter of that. And so it's all very much related to what we just saw. My Wi-Fi was unstable. Hopefully this works. I just want to not use too much of your time. We have an academic committee at GRASFI that selects in the end the paper and the program. And of course, we do not do this on our own. The committee consists of Christoph Nedopil, that you just saw as a moderator, Kerstin Lopata from the University of Hamburg, and myself, and a ton of reviewers across the globe, and both from GRASFI members and non-GRASFI member universities, as we wanted to have specialized reviewers for each paper. And we are about to start with the paper presentations in a minute. So I think it's important to know what was the background of all of this. We got more than 150 submissions. Many of those papers were mature. Some of them were less mature, but had a great idea. And out of that, we selected jointly with the reviewers 39 papers that will be presented, and some PhD papers on top of that. These were outside the 150. So I'm really pleased with the program, with the content, but also with the quality of the papers that are being presented. And also the topical variation. It really goes from asset pricing to preference measurement to development finance to green financing, I mean, central banks. You name it, sustainable finance and investment related in all kinds of facets. And of course, because people did so much, put so much effort in writing all these papers, there are also some awards. We will award these prizes that we have at the end of the program on Friday. We will definitely see some of you back, and also some of you that present. We will reach out to you that you maybe can be there at the prize ceremony. So we will have a prize for the best paper award. We will have a prize for the best PhD paper. We'll also have a prize for the best sustainable investment paper. I will tell you more about the exact sponsors and the exact papers during this prize session. But I think before I go and end this talk, I again would like to really commend the team of CUFE and the IIGF, so Wang Yao, Christoph Nedopil, and his whole team, lots of people working around them for organizing this and the whole process to get to a program. And also at the back, there's Patricia Ferrari running the show, and that's a lot of work, I can tell you. So I would like to thank all of you for doing that. And I would like to thank all of the people that present for bringing all your great papers to this conference. I hope to see you during the sessions. Good luck, everyone.
Rob, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. And thank you also for your support as the chair of the academic committee, and of course, also as the co-chair of GRASFI. Now, we're closing the opening session, and next up will be the first panel, which we'll have on central banks and regulators. So you will be, this session will be closed and you will be asked to rejoin the next session if you're staying directly in CVent. So thank you so much again for all the speakers. Thank you so much for the audience for listening in, and have a wonderful GRASFI 2021. Thank you very much.